Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I should say good morning, good afternoon and good evening wherever you are in the world. This is the fourth installment of our digital webinar series, our roadmap to COP26. A little bit about climate action. If you don't know us already, we have been around for since 2007 and our digital and live platforms build stronger partnerships between the business, government and NGO communities, all in the aim to accelerate international sustainable development and advance the Paris Agreement. So as I mentioned, today's digital event, our virtual exchange, forms part of this roadmap to COP26 digital series. The premise behind this is to enhance organizations' digital voice whilst we go through these strange and unprecedented times, and of course to maintain momentum towards COP26. Now I must let you know today's webinar is being recorded and you will have access to this within 24 hours of the webinar finishing today. Please do engage with us, take our survey at the end. It does help us create better digital event offerings, and your feedback is always welcomed. So I guess the next question is, how do you ask questions? We want as much engagement from you today. Please don't delay in getting your questions to us. Send them as soon as they come into your head. And I will try and get through as many questions today. All you simply have to do is go to the question section of the control panel, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. Please do let us know who you want to ask the question to. Please do put the speaker's first name and tell us where you're from as well. Tell us where you're from in the world and tell us what organization you're from. Alternatively, you can go onto Twitter. You can follow us at climate_action_. Use the hashtag #ClimateActionLive and you can ask your questions. So I am your moderator today. I'm the program director here at Climate Action, responsible for our innovation portfolio. So today's webinar, today's virtual exchange, today's content, what are we talking about? Today is all about the first defense, the demand side management. Now, many of you would have very much aware of the supply side of the energy transition, but just as important is how we consume and use energy as well, especially as industries are going to start going back to work after lockdown and we lift lockdown measures. So what are we going to be discussing today? We're going to be discussing policy incentives. How can policy complement innovation? We're looking at operational behavior. What role will the energy intensive industries play within grid flexibility? We're going to be looking at technologies. How will emerging technologies shape the energy systems of the future? And of course, those future energy systems. What will a clean energy system of the future look like and how do we get there? I would like to welcome our partner and sponsor for today, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Group. They're headquartered in Tokyo and they're one of the world's largest industrial firms. They provide world-class leading technological solutions across the entire energy value chain that enable industry-leading production efficiency and significantly reduce environmental impact. We're thrilled to have them join us today and we thank them for their support, and you will be hearing from them in the form of a presentation and joining the discussion as well. So onto our panel today. We have 4 fantastic panelists, all representing different segments of demand side management, if you will. We've got the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Group, Mr. Fukuzimi. We have Mark van Stipholt from the European Commission. He's part of the DG Energy Department. Catherine Barber, the Deputy Director of Industrial Energy Transformation at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And Marielle Letty, Senior Advisor at the Swedish Energy Markets Inspectorate. Just a reminder, please do ask your questions now that you know the panel, now that you know their names. We will try and get through as many as possible. And first up, we have Mitsubishi Heavy Industries to present. So without further ado, I'll welcome Mr. Fukuzimi. Please, can you join me on the stage?
Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you for giving us this opportunity to present our idea. for this current topic of demand side management. The name of Mitsubishi probably is known to everybody, but the MHI, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries group company, one of the group company, who are making that very big machines like gas turbine, steam turbine, boilers, nuclear power station, offshore wind turbine. So the energy business domain where I belong to, we knew this is going to happen. Renewable expansion, and then also the fossil power generation business is slowing down. So today's topic is demand side management. But since we are a comprehensive energy product company, I would like to talk about the energy transition from the slightly broader perspective, start mentioning how the COVID-19 will affect on the energy business and how digital will play a role in it. So there is a controversy as to when the global economic downturn will return to its previous level compared with the Lehman crisis. However, the decline caused by the new coronavirus is expected to bring about a completely different level of change from the past economic crisis. I think this is the end of conventional wisdom, which considers gathering and congestion as an efficient and good business model. With the explosive spread of the new virus on the global scale, everyone must have rediscovered the threat and realized there is an ongoing risk. The movement of the people in economic activity will not proceed as it has in the past, and certainly will be largely replaced by web conferencing like we are doing. Social distance will promote people to live away from megacity, which is decentralized way of living. However, the white collar productivity will rise and the energy consumption per unit of GDP will surely fall. In addition, as the cost of renewable energy declines and the interest in the ESG increases, the use of renewable energy in business will expand, and the businesses that rely on the fossil fuel will be reconsidered. On the other hand, renewable energy needs to be managed by a DX, so-called digital transformation, because it is so freaky and decentralized. I will explain this point in detail later. The business that relies on the human resources is viewed as a risk of business continuity, and the use of robots in manufacturing, construction, and remote control is expected to increase. This is really CX, corporate transformation, by DX, digital transformation. So the growth rate of energy consumption per GDP will decline, and the energy industry, including the electricity industry, will have to look at both CapEx and OpEx because of changes in the supply-demand balance. The consolidation and abolition of facilities and the energy saving will be promoted. In addition, if renewable energy at a reasonable price can be procured in the market, it will also be used to reduce energy consumption. Not only the major oil and gas companies, but also retailers are expected to actively adopt renewable energy to reduce their electricity costs. Under such circumstances, the introduction of renewable energy at the end of consumption will be promoted, making it more difficult to forecast electricity demand. Further, the capability of stabilizing the distribution system on the grid side becomes more important due to the increase in demand fluctuation. In some countries and regions where the rate of renewable energy introduction is high, the system is already unstable, and the renewable energy is forcibly stopped to ensure safety before the system becomes overloaded. To put it another way, it is a shift from the business model in which a large capitalized power company with a regional monopoly unilaterally sends the power generated by a large-scale power station facility, drawn on the left-hand side, to a democratic business model in which consumers own power generation facilities and manage their own energy portfolio. That is the right-hand side. I think this is something that should be welcome, but the question remains as to who will conduct stable supply and demand management. Number of countries are experimenting with the new market mechanisms to manage these challenges in a way that provides the incentives for users. The key is the DX, digital transformation. The number of energy consumers and the equipment that must be handled is enormous compared to the conventional one-way model. In order to predict all these changes, AI, artificial intelligence, technologies are needed for data analysis. This is the DX, digital transformation, which will make great strides in the energy sector in the future, and is little different from the IT business up until now. As for DX, the development of IT up to now can be called casual IT, centering on GAFA. The cost reduction of data storage and the communications contributed by casual IT will go to the next phase. We want to call it serious IT or professional IT. IT implemented in the business cannot afford to fail. I think casual IT has evolved with a lot of trial and error, but business doesn't allow that. It requires solid IT that will not fail, including security, and then IT applies to the machines and objects in the business field, which requires the ability to implement in the field that cannot be solved by just IT. We have a tendency to think that the machine-based business like ours have lagged behind in IT, but I expect there will be many areas in serious IT where we'll be able to demonstrate our abilities. Already, Tomoni, MHPS Tomoni, a digital twin based on a power generation equipment, and then the Energy Cloud, which uses AI to forecast power demand for consumers, have been developed and implemented over the past several years and have continued to improve on a proven track record and are sufficiently competitive. Thus, I would say digital transformation, DX, in the energy sector will evolve with CX, corporate transformation, and work to accelerate EX, energy transition or energy transformation. So in addition to DX, our company continues to propose solutions based on existing products as an equipment manufacturer. We are providing energy-saving equipment to industrial parks and cities, where we also apply advanced energy management system to maximize the usage of renewable energy. We also developed the cost-competitive renewable energy, which is offshore wind turbine. We are working on the improvement of the thermal efficiency of relatively clean natural gas power generation. For the promotion of using relatively clean natural gas at emerging countries, we are working on the development of floating LNG supply chain to exploit new demand for natural gas in emerging countries. Further, we started to develop the alternative fuel and its supply chain to eventually make their large thermal facilities carbon neutral. We will continue to focus on developing these heavy-duty, high-efficiency, high-performance machinery products and carbon neutral fuels to take advantage of them. So, since the first industrial revolution, mankind has increased the level of the energy handled, starting with the steam engines. With high temperature and high pressure, they have contributed to achieve more compact and economical energy conversion. This is also our company's strongest area. Considering the future global environment and economy, the energy level of this material conversion process need to be raised further. The theoretical combustion temperature that can be achieved with the fossil fuel is approximately 2000 degrees C. But this temperature can be raised to a higher level by creating free electrons. Direct material conversion can be achieved, such as immobilization as a carbon rather than CO2, or direct extraction of oxygen from the iron oxide. The ultimate form is actually nuclear fusion, but can various methods be considered even before that? From now on, everything will gradually be electrified in order to prevent the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. It is anticipated that the technology of direct material conversion utilizing electric power at such a high energy level will be required. And our company continues to develop such technology. With a long-term vision, MHI is a company that continues research and development in order to provide society with new economic value through innovation. This is the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Yasushi. That was a really insightful insight into Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and the future of technology in the energy space. So we've got some questions from the audience, and I've got a couple of questions that I just want to ask you as well. So you talked a lot about technology and emerging technologies. Can you give me a bit more detail about the AI tools that you were talking about, including the Energy Cloud, and I think it was the NHPS Tumoni, was it?
Yeah, can you open page 18?
Of course.
Yeah. So as we see the more renewable interaction into the society, as the topic of today is the demand side management, you're going to need still that reliable power generation resource to flexibly adjust, supply and demand situation. And for that, we have a digital twin technology called the MHPS Tumoni. Again, this is AI-based digital tool, and we apply to that all the energy equipment, power generation equipment, partially supplied by us. But this can be also applied to that any of the similar machines, if it's just a power generation equipment like engines or gas turbines, steam turbines. So we are trying to contribute that, the reliability of the machine by this AI tool. Another side, the demand prediction is also the very important, thing. The ability to provide such kind of, demand side management. You're gonna need to predict, your demand precisely. As the MHI group has 11 facilities across the nation, that we are spending so much electricity now at the factory. We by ourselves trying this tool and then the advanced this tool for that actual application. And then the external, we are providing already an external customer this tool already.
Fantastic. And look, a lot of these technologies are going to be contributing, or already are contributing, to decarbonizing our energy systems, especially, as you said, in factories and heavy industries. So I guess I wanted to ask, we are Climate Action, and that's why we're here today as well. What is this? What is the shift? This technology, or the shift towards a low carbon future? How does MHI deal with this? And do you have any solutions that are helping this transition?
Yep. I guess that if you could open up page 23, today that we are mostly most of the audiences in the Europe and probably US, and then those regions that we're talking about more on that cleaner world by deploying that renewable based the hydrogen and so on. But if you look at the emerging countries like Southeast Asia, still that they're gonna need a stable power source for their economic growth. So we created this the tool this is actually visualization tool called Quant. By simplifying the three major categories, economy, environment, and the social, and then the benchmarking the current situation, and then the setting a target for 5 years, 10 years later, so that they can think of the appropriate, infrastructure from the beginning. So and also this is used for the educational purpose for them to think of their own branding, because they're gonna need external investors to come. So if the place is not the clean, branding, they don't have the proper, the investors to come in for the, let's say, supply chain things and so on. So I think, in general, the emerging countries are gonna need this kind of, visualization tool for them to think of their own the energy transition by the proper the infrastructure. We offer that, fossil-based, probably a stable power supply, combined heat and power, but energy efficiency is also matters. So firstly, we introduce energy efficiency things, and then gradually changing the fuel to carbon neutral. Of course, that importing that renewable energy as much as possible. That is a kind of approach to them right now.
Okay, fantastic. And look, you just touched on hydrogen as a alternative fuel or a fuel for the future. We actually have a question from the audience that touches on hydrogen, a gentleman called Laxman. And he wants to know, in countries that are already importing LNG at a higher cost, will hydrogen become feasible in these countries, do you think?
Yeah, could you open page 20, probably 5? Yeah. So the hydrogen is one option, for replacing the fossil power generation, equipment. But in fact, generating the hydrogen may be okay. I mean, sooner or later it will come into that reasonable level in terms of cost. But carrying the hydrogen is probably a little bit challenging. To carry effectively the hydrogen, you're gonna need to raise the pressure and then also liquefying the hydrogen, which requires a very, very heavy infrastructure, resulting in that very high cost. So even for the country like Japan, we are importing the LNG, very big portion of the energy is relying on the LNG, but can we switch on the hydrogen, very quickly? It's going to be very difficult. The domestic production will go on, but the importing the hydrogen is probably a next thing. So we are looking at the other forms, like here that we are mentioning methanol, ammonia, and other carbon neutral fuel as well. So our intention is to utilize the existing, the energy equipment as much as possible by replacing with the appropriate, alternative fuel, including hydrogen. Sometimes it may be ammonia, sometimes it's biomethanol. So there are a variety of such considerations, not only just hydrogen.
Thank you so much, Yasushi. Look, I'm afraid that we are out of time and we're going to have to move on. So you are staying around towards the end of the presentation, I believe, and we are going to have a group discussion. So thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome. You're quite welcome. Thank you very much.
So now we're going to move on to Mark from the DG Energy at the European Commission. Mark, can I get you to join me on screen, please? Hi, Mark. Thanks very much for joining us today. Look, I'm just going to hand straight over to you if you want to introduce yourself very briefly, and then we'll get into your presentation. Thanks, Mark.
All right. Thank you, Reis. And thank you for inviting me for this extremely interesting and also necessary webinar. I'm very happy that we are continuing our work on the Green Deal, on making, let's say, achieving our Paris objectives, even in these COVID-19 times. So thanks very much for organizing this, and thanks to everybody in the audience for joining in to listen. My name is Mark van Stiphout. I work in the European Commission in DG Energy, in the Innovation, Clean Technologies and Competitiveness Unit. So that means that we are responsible for a large part of the Horizon 2020 budget, which is the European Research Program for the Research Innovation Program of the EU. And of course now as of 2021, that will become Horizon Europe. And we are also, of course, the ones who are making sure that the results from projects and research feed back into policy and vice versa. That is really kind of our key role as a unit within DG Energy and in relation to other parts of the Commission that are also involved in research and innovation. Good, so let's go to the next slide. Yes, thank you. So I will spend a little bit of time on the big picture of what the EU is doing at this very moment. I will not try to go into everything because it is a lot, but you have no doubt heard of the European Green Deal, which is the EU's program for the coming 5 years in order to make sure that we really set our economy and our society on course to a climate neutral and also a circular economy that is sustainable. And so that, of course, has a big energy dimension in there, but it is much more than just energy. Energy is, of course, plays a big role in reaching carbon neutrality, energy production, but energy use in transport and mobility, in industry, and also when we look at sustainability, looking at other, let's say, other natural resources and how to make sure that we respect the environment and create a sustainable society that doesn't kind of damage the long-term perspective of our planet. That is, of course, a very urgent and important agenda that has a lot of different dimensions. I will not go into all of that. I will just highlight a few things that we are putting in place kind of in the coming months that we are working on, and see how that then links in particular to what we are doing in relation to demand response. So I will give a bit of an overview further of what we're doing now in general with our policy initiatives, and then I will go specifically into things that we are doing to push demand response, both on the research side as well as on the policy side. Good, so let's go to the next slide. This we can fill as quickly as we can. So we have different things that are being prepared at the moment. We're working on a very important strategy that is called, and actually it's called energy system integration. So here still mentioned as smart sector integration. Of course, in essence, it's the same thing. It is looking at the transformation of the whole energy system. I think it's fair to say that our work so far, and I'll go more into that later, has, let's say, we've made great progress when it comes to the electricity system and making the electricity system more renewable. We are well on track to reach our 20% renewables objective in 2030. And most of that is in electricity. Actually, it means that in electricity, the shares of renewables is already close to 35% in the EU. So that is already 1/3. And on many days of the year, that is actually only renewables. It's 35% consumption is coming from renewables all over the year. So you can imagine that in many days, it's actually purely renewable fuel in many countries already. But we need to also, if we want to decarbonize, we need to look beyond the energy sector, the electricity sector. So the electricity sector is only something like 20% of the total energy consumption of the EU. A lot of it is in buildings, close to 40%. And then the rest of it is shared between transport and industry. And there are many sectors, many issues there that require further steps. On the one hand, further electrification, and on the other hand, also for the hard to electrify sectors, other things to decarbonize those sectors. And so therefore, we couple this strategy on energy system integration also with a hydrogen strategy that will come out at the same time, because we think that hydrogen will play a key role for the sectors that are hard to electrify as a way to decarbonize, provided of course that hydrogen is clean. As Susi already said, hydrogen is not a new thing. We know of it already for a long time, and we know how to produce it, but many of the ways how to produce it are based on fossil fuels and emit CO2. And I think, at least in Europe, I think the share of renewable hydrogen is only at 1%. So we, on the one hand, need to step up our production of hydrogen full stop to start using it in other sectors, but that only makes sense if we do it in a clean way. So these two strategies are coming out in July. Normally that should be on the 8th of July. This is not all. Then we have, for the third quarter of this year, we're going to put a big emphasis on the renovation wave, because as I said, 40% of our energy consumption comes from buildings. Many buildings are, let's say, old or too old, not so good insulated, not very smart. So this can be done much better. And our current rate to renovate is something like 1% a year. And of course, if we keep that rate up, then we're never going to be carbon neutral on time. So we need to really step up our investment in renovation, and that is so we're coming out with a plan how to do that in the third quarter of this year. We will also come with a Green Deal call as part of Horizon 2020. So putting the emphasis on research that we're going to do still this year with an additional 965 million euros to really push big steps in improving the technologies that we need for the Green Deal. And a lot of that is again linked to energy, and the things that we're promoting this year. So this will come out in September, will really focus on the key policy priorities of this year, like hydrogen, like system integration and sector integration. For example, linking hydrogen and renewable fuels with clean ports and airports, or decarbonizing industry and the chemical industry by trying to push research in the area of carbon capture and use, and combining that with hydrogen to produce sustainable feedstock for the chemical industry. Sorry, now you go too fast. So one back, please. So part of that will also focus on offshore, so pushing technologies in offshore energy, both renewable production, of course wind, but also other things like floating PV or ocean energy, as well as the grids, which is also a big important thing, and which is something that we will come back to in the fourth quarter of this year, when we will come out with a strategy on offshore renewables, because all our scenarios also show that if we want to reach carbon neutrality in 2050, we need to invest massively, but seriously massively, in offshore electricity production. And I think we're currently in the EU at something like 20 gigawatts, and our scenarios show that if we want to reach carbon neutrality, we need to go to something like 390, 450 gigawatts. Next slide, please. So this is what we're going to do, but we're not starting from scratch. We already had big steps, in particular when it comes to the electricity market, which is where also the core of our demand response policies are. So we have in 2016 proposed a clean energy for all European package, with legislation on energy efficiency, renewables, and the electricity market. That has been adopted in 2018 and 2019. So member states are implementing this right now. And I will not go into all the details of this, but the core of this package, it was very much focusing around the electricity market, but not only, it also looked at buildings, fuels, etc. But the core of it was very much linked to how can we make the energy market fit for renewables and renewables fit for the market. If they are 35% of the electricity market, then they are no longer, a side issue. They are really becoming the core of the market, and the market needs to be able to integrate them in the normal way. They cannot be the exemption anymore, and the renewable market and our electricity market, full stop, will not function if everything is driven by, let's say, special arrangements around renewables here and there. We really need to also update the way our market is organized and move away from, operating our system relying on big fossil fuel power plants that we can turn on and off, and move towards much more demand flexibility to be able to integrate renewables and allow all these distributed renewables to take their part in the market and be able to compete, even if they are much smaller, with the big fossil fuel power plants. For example, when it comes to network operators asking who can provide system services, and those rules were all designed for big fossil fuel power plants, but that is not the sustainable way for the future. So that is what we're trying to change with this package. And if you go to the next slide, please, the use of flexibility services as a way to make sure that the system becomes more flexible and is able to integrate more renewables is key. And of course, demand response is one of the key issues to make flexibility market work. So these are some of the provisions that are in the clean energy package. So we think that if we want to make demand response work, and if we want to be able to integrate higher shares of renewables, we need to allow for the competition and demand response and the flexibility at the wholesale market. And so let's say everything up to 1 hour, we need to allow that in the balancing market. So everything, let's say after 1 hour or within a quarter of an hour, like non-free, like frequency services and those kind of things. And we need to allow that kind of competition and the creation of flexibility markets also in congestion management and other services that are both at TSO and DSO level. So there are some very important provisions in the legislation that basically oblige network operators and member states to start creating these markets. For the wholesale market, it's of course key that you can measure when you consume what. And so not just a meter that you can read at the end of the year, but a continuous reading, so that if people adapt their consumption to the energy price and consume less when the price is low, that also shows up in their bill. For the moment, we just have night and day tariff. That's not good enough. It needs to be per quarter of an hour, also because of course with more renewables, the lowest prices are sometimes not in the night, but during the day when there's a lot of sun. And this can also be very local. So you have to have on the one hand the national or European-wide wholesale market where you reward flexibility and you can measure it because of smart meters. So smart meters are a cornerstone. And then you need the network operators to reward consumers who actually also adapt their consumption based on what the system or the grid actually requires. So things that are not necessarily done through the wholesale market, but that are done, let's say, to address congestion in a very local place by network operators procuring type of flexibility service. So basically meaning that network operators also can reward consumers for some kind of demand response action. But we think it's very important that this has to be done through market procedures. We don't want individual network operators to start contacting or contracting individual demand response with parties, because that doesn't create a real market where all the different technologies can compete with each other. So we need to look at what are the products and services that are being traded, how are they defined. That needs to be done by TSOs and DSOs together. And of course, the regulators are a key party in making this all happen. Yeah, so in the end, the idea is that this will reduce the cost of the grid investments that are going to be very high anyway. But we need all the flexibility in the system to contribute to integrating renewables. So this is, of course, these are very, go back one, please. So these are very important provisions, and they're also very innovative. We are going into demand response. We want this to be rolled out European-wide. It really requires a change of working for network operators. They need to work much more together. They need to interact much more with all the assets, so to say, that they don't own but that are connected to the grid and that can contribute to the stability of the grid and that can contribute to the integration of renewables. So we have been investing a lot in, first of all, let's say when we started in Horizon 2020, in technologies that really showed how this can work. So for example, can a PV panel contribute to system stability? And it was shown that this is perfectly possible. Going into much more, how does this actually work in a system? So the recent projects that we've been funding, which you see on the far right of the slide, the TSO-DSO cooperation projects that we have launched. We've launched two big ones in 2018, where we stimulate cooperation between TSOs and DSOs to jointly set up such flexibility markets where demand response can then be valorized. So we expect market parties, energy service providers, to gather their consumers to be able to respond to, let's say, the flexibility procurement and the flexibility markets that network operators set up. And these markets need to be linked. We cannot have TSOs, DSOs, and the wholesale market giving different price signals that conflict, because then we'll have a mess of a market. So this needs to be done in a very good coordination, and that's why we are setting up these projects, or that's why we have set up these projects, to stimulate that cooperation and to jointly explore what such a market should look like in the future. Now, this is where we are now. We're going to have a big project that will start very soon, that is even bigger than the current ones, that will really gather a lot of network operators together to see how to jointly set up such a market. And of course, the data sharing and the data infrastructure is a very important part of that. So it's on the one hand, how do you actually make such a market work by defining the products, the services, etc. And on the other hand, making sure that the data are being shared, because the energy system, at least in Europe, by definition, is one where you have multiple parties involved. So you need to be able to share the data among them to make sure that we can really create such markets in a coordinated way. We don't necessarily want the network operators to run these markets, because they can perfectly be done by the existing power exchanges or by, this is a competing business basically, but we need to have a basic way of sharing the data. So what we are really doing now is using our projects and our legislative implementing acts, for example, under the Clean Energy Package that are being prepared as we speak, for example, on interoperability, for example, on flexibility services, that they create a data-driven market for energy services that is open, competitive, and also respects privacy and cybersecurity. So that's what we're looking at in the energy system integration, and that will also be a big part of what we're going to support in Horizon Europe, for which we are basically drafting the plan and the programs as we speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. It's great to hear what the European Commission are doing in this space, and it looks like you've got a lot of work to do, but a good plan behind you as well. Look, we have run out of time for your session. However, I just want to ask one really quick question. How is the Commission promoting demand-side response and flexibility markets? What are you doing to encourage this strategy to work?
So we have the basic legislation that is set in place that puts the principles out there. So we're working with member states to see that this is implemented as quickly as possible. We're working with regulators by involving them closely into the projects to see how this can also be done through the detailed rules, because making these demand response markets work is very often a matter of quite detailed rules. You really have to make sure that you protect the consumer interest. You have to regulators need to approve that these are markets that are being created, and we really want to see this in a market-based way. So the projects, we see it very much that the projects are exploring how this can work and testing this at a systemic level, and that it is then a matter of, let's say, when it comes to rolling this out at a bigger scale, it needs to be proven that it can work through the projects, but it needs to be accommodated by the regulators making this possible. So bringing those two together so that regulators can anticipate what is coming is a key part of our work, so that we can basically anticipate the rules, and that we don't have successful projects that need to wait 2 or 3 years for actually to be rolled out at a larger scale. We don't have that time.
Yeah, Look, and that's great because we have a regulator that we're going to hear from in a minute from Sweden, and you know, the projects that we need to scale is exactly what our next speaker is going to be talking about. How does the government? Thank you so much, Mark. We're going to move on. Please do stay around because you will be joining us for the panel discussion at the end. But we're going to move on to Catherine, who is actually going to talk about what you just picked up on, Mark, and is looking at how do you scale, how do the government incentivize these emerging technologies. And there you are, Catherine. Hi, Catherine. Thank you so much for joining us. So look, I'm going to hand over to you. We have 10 minutes for the presentation and some questions. The floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Rhys. It's great to be with you all today. So I'm going to be talking about what the UK government is doing to promote decarbonisation and energy efficiency and demand management in industry. That's the area that I work in BEIS, in the Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy. I'm going to talk about a few things about carbon pricing, about tax incentives for energy efficiency, the behavioural nudges we're trying to stimulate, and then some grant funding programmes that we're running. And in 10 minutes, I certainly won't be able to tell you about every policy incentive, but I do hope to illustrate how comprehensive the government's programme for industrial decarbonisation is becoming in the UK. So next slide, please. So the first thing I want to really emphasize is that decarbonisation is the law in the UK. This is not an optional nice to have. It's something that the Climate Change Act from last year made a legal requirement that the whole of the UK reaches net zero emissions by 2050. And industry and business between them represent about a quarter of UK total emissions, and that means if we're getting to net zero as a country altogether, then industry needs to really decrease its energy use and its emissions very rapidly. There just isn't a place for any sector to hide anymore. So many companies who are investing now will still be using the equipment and the technology that they're choosing today, certainly in the 2030s, probably the 2040s, maybe the 2050s. I even visited a factory not so long ago that was still using a kiln to make bricks with, which had been installed in 1953. So companies who are investing now really need to think about what is compatible with a net zero target in 2050, because if they don't, then their assets and their investments will be stranded and will not be worth anything. So next slide, please. So just a reminder that for UK decarbonisation, one of the fundamental policies, one of the pillars of our effort is carbon pricing. We were enthusiastic proponents of cap and trade when we were an EU member. We believe it creates an incentive for companies to reduce their emissions in a cost-effective, technology-neutral way. The government isn't saying how something should happen, but it's making clear the pathway. And having the emissions trading scheme mobilizes private sector investment into demand management and into cleaner technologies. So earlier this month, the government published its plans for the UK emissions trading system, which will come into effect at the start of next year. We expect there will be a very smooth transition for industry from the existing EU system to the new one. All of the administrative procedures will be familiar. We have said that the cap is going to be 5% tighter than it would have been if we'd stayed in the EU system. And that's because the government really wanted to show that it was committed to climate action. But emissions trading is a core part of what we're doing to incentivize business. We also have tax incentives. So that, yes, this slide on climate change agreements, thank you, you're moving nicely on. So on climate change agreements, these are voluntary agreements between business and government, which are there to reduce energy consumption and to cut carbon emissions. And if companies enter into these agreements and they do what they've pledged, then they get a discount in the climate change levy. So they essentially pay less tax. And in our latest budget in 2020, it was confirmed that the current scheme was going to be open to new entrants and then extended for a further 2 years until 2025. So there's that certainty as well for companies that if they do tackle their demand for energy, then they can get a discount in the taxes that they pay. And if you're interested in the results, of how that's been working over several years. We published an evaluation of the CCAs in April. You can find it online. And it showed that the agreements do drive energy efficiency. If you're on a participating site in the scheme, you used at least 4% less electricity than on the non-participating sites. And in the energy intensive sectors, that effect is considerably higher. So it's not a revolution, 4%, 10% in the energy intensives. It's not a total transformation to net zero, but it's part of the answer. So next slide. Let's talk about behavioural nudges. So the UK now requires that all large companies disclose their energy use and disclose their carbon emissions, and that they publish those reports on an annual basis, and that company directors are signing off on those publications. And companies right now are completing their first reports, which were covering the financial year 2019-2020. So they have to submit that by the end of this year, pretty much. And the kind of behavioural idea behind this is that it makes sure that it's not just energy managers and the kind of the experts at the engineering level, but it's also the company's senior management, that they've got an idea about their carbon footprint, they know what their energy demand is, and hopefully that should drive their strategic investment decisions. And also, of course, it's important information for investors and for the financial markets. And as those big investors, the pension funds and so forth, as they're thinking, who do we invest in this year? And they're thinking about the government's net zero target and the fact that there will be these stranded assets if companies aren't doing the right thing. Having these streamlined energy and carbon reports makes it more likely that they will make the right investments. So next slide. So all of that was a lot of rules and regulations. But there is some good news for companies, which is that the government is providing quite a lot of money in the form of grants to help companies to deliver projects that reduce their demand for energy. One example is this one, the Industrial Energy Efficiency Accelerator. This supports innovative technologies, or perhaps the innovative application of technology in a new setting in industry. We've currently got 16 projects going across a different range of sectors. The top image that you can see here is where we've sponsored the extraction of nutrients, ammonia, from wastewater to create fertilizer. And we think that this technology, this particular project, is going to demonstrate a 90% reduction in electrical energy use compared to the traditional way of doing this process. And the bottom image is a particularly efficient recovery of fuel from waste, which is led by a firm called Magnomatics. So these are projects that this fund has now been going for 5 years, and we're trying to bring through faster the energy efficiency technologies. Next slide, please. And then as we move from innovation and early demonstration, we're then trying to help companies as well to demonstrate technologies on a large scale and to deploy them on a commercial basis. So this is the fund actually that I'm personally responsible for. The government made £315 million available to be spent in the next 4 years. And the IETF will open its first application window very shortly, and will be seeking bids from manufacturing companies. Maybe they want to deploy more energy efficient technology, or they want to do studies for future big projects. And this year we're looking to award £30 million of funding. So if you have any good ideas for manufacturing energy efficiency, please do look out for this fund. It's going to publish all of the guidance really shortly. £30 million this year, and then we'll be going into more ambitious projects from 2021 onwards. And then last slide, I just wanted to say we do more than just energy efficiency and demand reduction. I know that that's the subject of today's discussion, but it does only take us so far. And if we're trying to get to net zero, yes, of course we should do these easier things, the low-hanging fruit, but we also need to think about difficult stuff like big infrastructure projects, the networks for carbon capture and storage, the production and use of low carbon hydrogen, as the other panelists have said. And so just one thing I'd like to tell you about is that we have a mission to set up net zero industrial clusters, that we want to set up the world's first net zero industrial cluster within 20 years. And the reason it matters in the UK, this is a bit different from some other countries, but more than half of our industrial emissions are concentrated in just 6 sites. And so what the government is doing is it's currently funding all 6 of those different clusters to come up with roadmaps of how they would decarbonise. And then we've got up to £170 million to get projects going in practice that will help those companies collectively to go carbon neutral. So that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour from me, just some illustrations of the policies we have on offer, and I'm really happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you for joining us and that very insightful presentation on I guess how some of our audience might even be able to get involved with some of these funds. And on that note, we do actually have a question from Dorian Banks that I'd like to put to you first, considering you finished on that slide. So Dorian says, what will be the threshold for participation in new UK ETS? What is energy intensive defined as in megawatts, or how can you define it? Is there a barrier, a threshold?
So I think the best thing I can do is refer anyone to the document we published on the 1st of June, which set out the UK ETS plans. So any of the government's policies will be in there. My understanding is it is really very similar to what companies will have experienced as part of the EU system, because our aim is to make this as smooth as possible as we transition next year. I'm afraid I don't know the exact number on the megawatts, but I'm sure it's all in that document, or it'll be forthcoming shortly.
Fantastic. Look, Catherine, we're going to move on, but you're going to join us at the end. There's a lot of questions for you, and we can put you in touch as well. So thank you so much, and please stay around, and we'll move on to our next speaker. So can I would like to welcome Marielle. Marielle's a senior advisor at the Swedish Energy Markets Inspectorate. They are a market regulator in Sweden. Hi, thank you so much for joining us. Look, in the absence of time, I'm just going to get hand over to you. So if you could start your presentation, then we'll ask some questions at the end.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Riz. And thank you very much for the opportunity to say a few words from the regulatory perspective on this very important topic. As some of you might be aware, we have quite ambitious plans in Sweden for renewables. We have a multi-party agreement that by 2040 we're going to have 100% renewables in our energy system, and that's quite ambitious. We also have some really heavy industry like steel industry, SSAB, and our mining industry through LKAB, that together with one of our big energy actors, Vattenfall, has the ambition to have fossil-free steel production by 2045. So these types of goals, of course, also affect us as regulators and kind of policy developers for incentives connected to the grid. So that's a backdrop for my presentation. So I'm trying to guide you through a regulatory perspective on these topics and also customer perspective in a sense. So bear with me. Next, please. So we're living in a world, as you all know, really looking at a very much digitalized society. We have a great trend of urbanization also and electrification. And this, of course, is something that we also as regulators have to take into account when we work, because energy is a very important infrastructure for many reasons, and it becoming more and more important by the day, also looking towards the climate goals made and the transition needed in that area. Next, please. What we see also is that we see a transition in how the power system is developed. We saw a presentation earlier also touching on this issue, and from our perspective is we go from a more centralized approach, looking at really big production units, nuclear and water power and such, and also looking at great grid infrastructure connecting the users to this production. The new technology actually makes it possible to have a more decentralized solution for power system development, and we see this as a very fast moving trend. And this is also that puts quite a lot of strain on the way we formulate the regulation and how we can help this transition where it's needed, and how we still can maintain grid stability. Next, please. So I just want to touch on this to kind of lay the floor for the coming pictures, looking at consumption patterns and looking how customers really use energy. And this might be familiar to many of you, but we can see when we look at electricity consumption over the year and over the week, we can see that in Sweden, in the northern area, of course, we have a higher consumption in the winter than the summer. And also looking at over the week, we see very little, so to say, movement. Only in the weekends we can see a bit of a higher consumption. And I'm going to come into why I talk about the customer consumption patterns in a minute. Next, please. So looking at the consumption, also the second consumption picture over the day, over the 24 hours in the day, we can see that we have a peak in the morning and a peak in the afternoon. In the morning when we get ready to go to work or school or whatever, and then when we come home. And those peaks are not insignificant. Those peaks have been driving many of us, making a lot of regulatory measures to even out those peaks, because we do have some strains in our systems during those peaks, usually in the winter, but also depending on where your country is placed, could also be in the summertime, of course. We can also see that these peaks correlate with the spot price during these hours, of course, and that we have an energy-only based market in the Nordic area, common market. So that means, of course, that it's very driven by demand, the price peaks in that. Moving on, next, please. So looking at these peaks from a regulatory perspective and from a societal perspective, because we do have high demand on a really high quality electricity 24/7. And how are we going to meet this going forward, really? We work a lot on flexibility or demand side management or demand response. There are many words to describe sort of the context. So you could either move the usage, kind of even out the peak. You can reduce the peak totally, so you don't move the consumption to another period. Or sometimes you also have to increase the usage, basically. Please go on. So with this, back please, one. Press, thank you. No, the next one, but just press once. Thank you. As a regulator, we also need to have some type of customer acceptance of this type of changes we need to make in our system to help have a more flexible system, so we can have a large amount of renewables in our system, and so that we can have this transition towards the electrification of transport and industry, basically. So that also requires some type of activity or commitment on the customer level. So we had a really big exercise, really discussing with customers representing heavy industry, mining, Stora Enso, Holmen, you know, the big wood industry, so to say. We talked with the big real estate owners who are really real estate developers, and household customer representatives, and also small and medium businesses, to discuss with them the topic of really engaging in market activity and the willingness to really be more flexible with the usage. So it was quite an interesting exercise, and for me, the first time I worked quite a while in this area, having all these types of customers interact and discuss together. Next, please. Thank you. So what we could see as a conclusion of this exercise is that there was a great level of positivity and I would say willingness to participate overall across the board on these different segments. But there was a very strong position on possibility to choose. So great willingness to participate if you can choose when to participate and not, and also a variety of offers or ways to be flexible. So not just, you know, yes or no, but also variation in the participation. And of course, especially I would say with the small and medium-sized enterprises and the bigger users, production or business goes first. You have to produce what you're going to deliver to your customers, and then within that scope, you see what you can do. And of course, steel is a bit more difficult looking at the processes there. Next, please. So we as regulators then looking at these trends, global trends, really looking at the political goals of 100% renewables by 2040, big electrification of really heavy industry, even though they are looking at hydrogen very much. And this picture is really to reflect, I'm sorry, it's in Swedish here, but it's really to reflect the market, the complexity of the electricity system, so to say. And this would, I would say, most of European regulators and many others also recognize this, that we have in the yellow part, upper left, we have the distribution grid. On the right part, we have the market parts, looking at wholesale markets, for example, looking at suppliers, aggregators, and things like that. Below left, we have the system responsibility and system operations. And then on the lower right, we have the transmission grid. And in our countries, it looks a bit different, which actor or stakeholder is responsible for which part. But in the Nordic area, for example, looking at the distribution grid, we have plus, I would say, 100 in each country, almost local grid operators. And we have quite a few suppliers looking at the green part there, 120 plus in Sweden, for example. Looking at the system responsibility in the transmission grid, there we usually have, for our part, I think Germany has quite a few actually, but usually there's one responsible party. And why I want to show this picture is that we have a monopoly side of the markets, and then we have a competitive side. And when developing new rules for flexibility, for example, we need to take that into consideration. And we could hear from the Commission earlier, we have this big fourth package, or the CEP as we call it. There we have another, so to say, development looking at flexibility resources being, as we interpret, more on the competitive side of the market. Next, please. So flexibility resources could be many things. We talk about storage, we talk about load control or load management, so to say, and we talked about production control or management. And then we have a new area for many of us, aggregation or aggregating load, so that smaller users or smaller production units and storage units also can participate with their flexibility and in markets, national or regional or local, for example. And we very much look forward to having these new types of contributions really to manage this transition in the renewable part of the production. Next, please. And also reflection on resources. This is just to show you these more or less happy faces here. And really on the left side, we have storage, we have flexibility, demand response, we have really the traditional line and copper and fiber building of the network, so to say. We have heating, gas, and water power. Also looking at the flexibility needs and where we need to put the correct, so to say, carrots to develop these parts. We need to see not all flexibility resources are good for everything. Sometimes you need something for seconds or less than seconds. Sometimes you need something for hours or days or seasons even. So we have to be very careful to use our resources in the most efficient way to get the most outcome, because in the end, it is always the customer that pays for these types of developments. Next, please. So you can put I think there are 3 bullet points. So just to summarize, we need flexibility. I think there are maybe 2 more. 1 more. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, that's it. So first of all, we have the peaks, morning and late afternoon. We have a large amount of renewable intermittent energy coming into our systems that needs smarter grids, basically. And also a really big electrification of the transport system, even though we have a lot of biogas also. But and hydro, we will see what happens with that. So and then we also have the new dilemma for us, at least in Sweden, looking at capacity issues and bottlenecks because of this large urbanization movement. We had a high level of production, and you know, business was going really well. So that also put new strains on the grid, really, to that level that in the end we were not able to connect everyone that wanted to be connected to the grid when they wanted to be connected. So that is really a sense of urgency for us now, actually. So that's we're working with flexibility in that support. Yes, thank you. And then maybe you can do, and yes, thank you very much. So all in all, we believe that this smart grid that we're trying to develop with different regulatory tools and also to be able to have this flexibility I mentioned before will give both users and producers and also tech providers, really, and third-party stakeholders new opportunities to contribute to a sustainable system. And also these technical solutions and the digital solutions and the amount of data and really processing this data and using it efficiently, we believe is going to be a really big game changer. And maybe it's not the traditional energy actors that are the best at this today, or maybe some of them will develop these skills and some not. We will see. But however, we see that business models and roles and responsibilities in this new energy world really is equally important, and we really, as a regulator and also policymaker, need to bring, you know, do our part in this transition. And the last picture, I think now. You can, it's one more. Thank you. So what do we as regulators do then to enable this transition in a way that is responsible and also contributes to grid stability, of course? We work quite a lot with pricing and pricing signals. We look at developing existing national markets connected to flexibility, for example, to make sure the bid levels are okay, and looking at the technical requirements so demand flexibility can participate on equal level as production, for example. We look at efficient use of the grid. What type of network regulation do we need to have to incentivize grid operators to use smart grid solutions in their grid and not only choose traditional technique, even though this is also needed? We need to see an innovation here and some courage in using the new technique that might build the grid a bit faster sometimes, and maybe also at a lower cost. And then we have flexibility markets. We have heard the Commission mention this before. We think that this could be a really also a game changer, looking at local, regional, and developing national markets, where the grid operator then could shop or buy electricity flexibility, and the customer could offer it there, really. And the customers then, we believe that access to information is key, and lower obstacles for new stakeholders that can offer customers these smart new deals. Thank you. I was rushing through. And regulatory sandboxes came in there, and we're really looking forward to that. I can't hear you.
I was on mute there, sorry about that. So look, I'm going to ask everyone to come back onto the screen and join us. We're going to go through a couple of we've got lots of questions, but not much time. So we're going to try and get through quite a few of them. But look, thank you very much, Marielle, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us as well today. So look, I think out of Marielle's presentation, there's one conclusion for me is there's no one glove fits all solution, and you need a lot of options to try and incentivize lots of different stakeholders to really accelerate this transition. I think going on from that, we've had a lot of questions about different regions. Obviously, we've heard from Europe, and Yasushi, you're joining us from Japan. But what are different regions doing? Will they develop different technologies, and will they develop different technologies and go in different directions? Are other regions looking at Europe as a case study? What are your thoughts on that, Yasushi?
So we live in the very advanced countries where that economic growth is relatively slowing down. But if you look at the other rest of the world, especially like Southeast Asia, they are growing, and they're gonna immediate need, all the energy. So renewable energy, of course, they want to increase, but they want to have that more stable energy supply as well. So that means we have to have that proper balance of the energy and the environment, which we try to educate, and then also that show that some of the index, visualization index, by having the three simple way of economy, environment, and then the society. So we call it the QOEN, QOEN, the methodology to visualize such indices so that they can think of their own strategy of branding, their location, because they're going to need an external investor from the Western Hemisphere, like Google or Apple, or as a supply chain. They need to offer CO2 neutral, supply chain things for them. So for that purpose, we are offering such kind of index, too, for them.
Okay, thank you so much. And look, Mark, what do you think? Do you think people are looking to you for direction? Mark, you're on mute, I think.
Yeah. So now it should hear me, right?
Yes.
No. Well, I think let's say of course. I think so. Yeah. I mean, not to be falsely modest or so, but of course we are not the only one who are setting the direction. And what the Commission does is basically what the heads of state together decide that needs to be done, and then we turn that into, let's say, we turn that into concrete measures and, for example, legislation and concrete policies. But it's clear that the EU wants to be the continent that leads the discussion and that leads the way on on how to become carbon neutral. And I think we're also really showing that it's possible. So I think that across the world, people can see that you can turn a very, let's say, a well-developed, a very connected economy from a fossil fuel-based system into a renewable-based system without, let's say, with challenges, but without wrecking yourself. It's very well possible. I think if you look back 10 years ago, people were very skeptical if you could actually integrate 20% of renewables into the existing system. And I think we've shown that that's possible. It's working. And our security of supply is still, I think, if you look at what type of system we have, I think the electricity system in the EU is one of the most complex systems in the world. And we have a security of supply rate of higher than 99.99%. So I think, I hope we can be an example globally how this can be done. And when it comes to then within Europe, how we actually need to go about it, I think, what I mentioned of how we do that, it's of course, we try to push the boundaries a bit, and we try to challenge the stakeholders. But we are doing this very much in a dialogue because we realize that this needs to be done together. And so this, I think the presentations also clearly showed that there is a need to coordinate this. We cannot leave this to individual parties to jointly come up with the best outcome. It really requires a coordination, which is something that is by definition a task for the government. Yeah,
and look, Catherine, you're nodding along there. Obviously we won't say the B word here, but that's kind of we've forgotten about that almost. But look, what about your perspective? Obviously, there's a lot of the UK is holding the COP26 presidency, and the eyes are on the UK, so to speak. How are you looking to transition in that sense?
Yeah. Thanks, Reese. Yeah, I should have said we're super excited about hosting COP26 next year. We're sorry, obviously, it wasn't this year, but in some ways it sets us interesting challenges for 2021 because we will then be talking a lot, I'm sure, about clean and resilient recovery. And so although industry, although all sectors of the economy have taken a really big hit this year, and there needs to be rebuilding. I think we're all, all across Europe, we're trying to build back better. And I'm absolutely certain that is going to be a theme, both of the COP26, of the G7, G20 discussions next year, which we're looking forward to, as well as continuing to work with our European partners on this issue.
Fantastic. And look, Marielle, I want to bring you into the conversation here. Obviously, we just touched on COP26 and the climate goals. There's been so much discussion around different stakeholders and different technologies, but what do you see being that breakthrough technology or the technology that's going to be having the greatest impact on helping large power users or the industrial industries being able to reach their climate goals?
That's a good question. I was mentioning previously hydrogen, looking at the steel industry, for example, and mining industry. There's some great hopes in developing that technique to be able to change the processes there. And looking at customers overall and this decentralized scene that I think we will have, storage and storage units, when we see a decrease in price, as we have seen for solar panels, I see that as a game changer also, actually.
Yeah, and then look, that's two things that I think Yasushi you touched on, and Mitsubishi are very progressing and see that as two major technologies that are going to play a very important role in the kind of clean energy future, hydrogen and storage. So are you working in Europe, and what about Europe? Are you looking to Europe as a leader?
So I think that it depends on the availability of the renewable energy. If you look at the North Europe, you have abundant of wind energy available. So you can naturally think of the hydrogen, the utilization. And but compared with the other places like Japan, that we don't have such nice places. So we need to look at the other areas, regions where that renewable energy is so abundant, like North America, North Midwest, America, and then also that South Australia, for example. So our guys in the States is currently working at the project in Utah, where that they are generating the hydrogen from the renewable power, and then store that hydrogen in the salt carbon, underground. And we are also looking at the South Australian, the place where that hydrogen can be easily made by renewable energy. So we are talking to some local partner guys for the development of that project right now.
There's so many questions coming in, and I wish we could get through them all, but we are sadly out of time. I'm just going to ask this one last question, which is from Anand Saprathama. And I would like everyone to answer it very quickly, just with a couple of words. So the question is: decentralization, decarbonization, and digitization. It seems to be the trend, but who shall steer this? Who should steer this? And what are the key challenges that you all face? Mark, you're on mute, Mark.
You said short, because that's quite a question. But I think, particularly the link between those three require coordination. Data sharing is data sharing. It requires that you need to have arrangements of how information is shared. If we want to make a decentralized and digital system work, it needs to work because the data is being shared as far as it's necessary between different parties to make this total system work. I don't think anybody really wants to disconnect, let's say, outside of a few hippies somewhere in the desert. So, we need coordination, and we need to do this together. And I think that is also the biggest challenge. How do we bring these parties together? And that is not just energy sector. If we talk digitization, it also goes beyond into other sectors. Appliances are used for different purposes, not just energy. So keeping an overview, making progress, and at the same time keeping it coordinated, I think that's a big challenge for us.
And Catherine, what about yourself and the UK?
Thanks. Maybe just to pick up on one of the ideas in that question, which is about the having a proliferation of initiatives, of different ideas, of different projects. Yes, of course, coordination is a good thing. Strategy is really important. But I think we also have to accept that in this huge transformation we need to make in a matter of a generation, then there will be a lot of projects that start. Some will fail. You know, we're testing out all of these different technologies for industry where I work. Some of them will make a huge amount of money. Some of them will not be heard of in 10 years' time. So I think we just have to recognise that, and politicians have to be prepared for that innovation, rapid innovation, and also quite a bit of failure.
And Marielle, how are you bringing everyone together to address the question, decentralization, decarbonisation, and digitization?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and I think the coordination, because in my opinion there is a lot of knowledge, we have a lot of good technology, and now we need to implement and try and test. And I agree with Catherine, there will be some things that will be less successful. However, we need to put a move on really and start working really hard. So we're actually launching an initiative this fall that's going to be a dialogue with the industry, energy actors, authorities, and others to really practically get good examples and start doing really good stuff in the field, so to say.
Perfect. And Yasushi, some final comments for you. How is Mitsubishi going to help decentralization?
So the public sector is going to play the important role for setting up the market mechanisms, incentive program for all the participants, prosumers. And we, as a technology provider, contribute to that program jointly and provide the necessary technology, like AI-based, digital twin, or AI-based, demand prediction program. As such that we are participating to that public sector-led, project.
Look, I'm sure we could go on, but unfortunately that is time today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us from across the world, really. It's probably pretty late for you now, Yasushi in Tokyo, so I'll let you go and get home. But yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panel. Thank you for everyone tuning in today. It's been a very interesting hour or so. So I'll ask you to, everyone, if you could just turn off your mics and your camera. I'm just going to wrap today's webinar up. Okay, next slide.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Yasushi. Thank you. So I just want to say thank you very much, Yasushi and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Group, for supporting us today. Please do go and check them out. They've got some fantastic technologies that are helping the decarbonisation of heavy industries. And you heard about some of those today. Please do take the survey, which is going to be sent to you after this webinar. And please do subscribe to climateaction.org to find out more about our roadmap to COP26. Next up, we are very excited to have just launched the second edition of the Climate Innovation Forum. This will be a virtualized forum, given the nature of where we are at the moment. Please do join us on the 1st of July. We will be using our virtual event platform. You can register on our website. You can register by following the link in the email that you will receive after this. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm sure we'll see you soon. Goodbye from the Climate Action team.